Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really diving into a theological question that might genuinely shift how you think about some concepts you probably feel are very familiar. We've been working with some fascinating material, specifically looking at excerpts from a text called Is Everything Sacrifice? A Biblical Review of Zebah. So, our goal today really is to unpack a pretty common misconception, this idea that the whole biblical system of offerings and even how we use the word sacrifice today can all just be lumped together. We might say sacrifice for the cross or for our giving or our service. But what this research suggests is that this kind of generalization, even if it's well meaning, sort of flattens out the really rich landscape of biblical worship. And it can actually obscure the precision of Christ's work.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating when you dig in is just how precise that ancient system really was. We're going to excavate the specific meaning of this key Hebrew term, zebah, that's spelled Z-E-B-A-H, and we'll see how understanding its unique role, especially when you contrast it with other offerings, it lays the groundwork for, well, a renewed clarity. And I think a really liberating one, particularly when we think about Christ's work and the nature of the Lord's Supper. You're definitely in for some aha moments, I think.
Okay, so let's unpack this journey into the Levitical system. I know it often seems, archaic, maybe distant, but it's really far from primitive. The authors we're reading point to two absolute pillars holding this whole thing up: blood, desem, and fire, esh.
Right. And if we connect that to the bigger picture, these weren't just, elements in some primitive ritual. Blood, specifically thinking about the blood of the covenant, Nazim Haberet from Exodus 24, that was an act of unification. It created this bond, a shared life between Yahweh and his people. It was never, ever about bribing some angry God. And the fire, like that amazing inaugural fire in Leviticus 9, that was the clear sign of divine acceptance. It was like heaven's yes. God showing he chooses to dwell with his people, consuming the offering to seal that communion.
Okay, so the covenant had a boundary, a structure. And our sources explain that the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, wasn't just a moral code. It was more like the insurmountable constitution of this relationship. And within that boundary, you had these specific rites of maintenance, things like the Asham for restitution, Chatat for purification, Shilamin for communion, and Ola for, well, assent or total offering. They were designed to keep things holy, to restore communion when, unintentional mistakes or impurities happened.
Which, of course, raises a huge question. What happened when that boundary wasn't just accidentally crossed, but fundamentally betrayed? What was the fix for sins done with an open hand, prodroma? Those deliberate acts of rebellion, basically high treason against the king.
And the classic case, King David, after the whole thing with Bathsheba and Uriah, it gives us such a devastating and really revealing answer. Our sources point out he didn't run to the tabernacle. Why? Why not?
Well, he knew, didn't he? He knew instinctively his actions had put him completely outside the jurisdiction of the ritual system. There wasn't a ritual fix for what he'd done.
Right. And that makes his cry in Psalm 51, verse 16, so incredibly important. For you do not desire sacrifice, zibah, or I would give it. You do not desire burnt offering, olah.
Yeah.
Why those two specifically? David mentions zibah and olah, and the answer, our sources argue, it isn't trivial. It's actually the key to dismantling one of the biggest misunderstandings in, well, a lot of Christian theology.
Mm-hmm. This idea that all the Levitical offerings are just generic sacrifices, it really does flatten that rich topography of biblical worship, as the text puts it. The term zebah, it's not generic at all. It refers exclusively and consistently to one particular type, the peace offering or the well-being offering, the shelamin. And its core idea, it's a communion meal, shared, celebrated, right there in God's presence.
Okay, and this is where it gets really interesting, I think. Our sources really stress the astonishing complexity and precision of the Hebrew Bible's liturgical system. Ignoring these distinctions, they say it's like reading a musical score, but ignoring the keys, the tempo markings, the dynamics. You might hear the notes, sure, but you completely miss the music.
Absolutely. And scholars like Jacob Milgram, they've pretty conclusively shown that the root of this word zebah, it implies killing an animal for a meal. That's the core idea. So this offering, the Zebah B'Shalom, it was unique because it ended with a shared meal between three parties, actually. God, the priest, and the person making the offering, along with their family.
Just try to picture that for a second. An Israelite coming to the tabernacle courtyard, not feeling weighed down by guilt, not somber or penitent, but with a heart just, overflowing with gratitude, maybe fulfilling a vow they made, or maybe just wanting to celebrate the shalom, that deep peace, that wholeness, that well-being that they enjoyed because they were part of God's covenant people.
Yeah, and the ritual itself reflects this. A specific part, The fasts, which were seen as the portion of honor that was burned on the altar for God. The priest, as the mediator, got his designated share. But here's the extraordinary part. Most of the meat was given back to the offerer, to be shared in a joyful meal. With family, with friends, right there in the sacred courtyard. It was literally a feast with God, a liturgical embodiment of communion. Gordon Wenham describes it perfectly, calls it a feast to the Lord in which the offerer and his family eat part of the sacrificed animal in the presence of God. So it was all about participation, celebration. It kind of reenacted that amazing moment back at Sinai when the elders saw God and ate and drank. You see, it wasn't primarily about atonement or getting purified. It was about enjoying communion with God and the community.
Okay, so to really nail down the uniqueness of the Zebah meal, our sources emphasize we have to contrast it with the other main types of offerings because each one had a very specific job, a specific grammatical function within the covenant language.
Right. Let's start with the Akko. It's often translated sin offering, but a much better label is probably purification offering. Its main job wasn't forgiving moral guilt in the way we might think of it. It was about purifying the sanctuary itself from ritual pollution, stuff caused by unintentional sins or bodily impurities. Sin, in their worldview, was almost like a toxic substance, something that literally contaminated sacred space. And the blood in the Eder rite was handled in very specific ways to cleanse the tabernacle, the sacred geography. And here's the crucial bit. The offerer never ate any part of it. The whole point was solemn removal of a stain, not festive communion. So naturally, it's never called a zebah. They're just doing two completely different things, theologically speaking, mutually exclusive.
Okay, so purification is one distinct category. Then there's the Ham, the restitution offering or guilt offering. What was its specific focus?
Yeah, the Arshu was all about restitution, making things right. It was required when someone committed sacrilege, maybe misused holy things, or wronged their neighbor, things like fraud or theft. The logic seems pretty clear. Before you could fix the vertical relationship with God, you had to repair the horizontal one with your neighbor. So the offender had to make restitution, pay back the value of the damage, plus a penalty, an extra fifth. Its function was fundamentally reparation, rebalancing the scales, not festive communion, and just like the offer didn't eat. So again, it's not a zebus, different purpose entirely.
Right, and that brings us to the third main type, the ascent or Holocaust offering. This is the other one David mentioned in Psalm 51.
It's exactly the jak, commonly called burnt offering, or sometimes holocaust. But the Hebrew name actually comes from a root meaning to ascend. This rite represented total devotion, complete surrender to God. Now, unlike the zebah, where parts were shared, here the entire animal, except maybe the skin which went to the priest, was consumed by the fire on the altar. Its smoke ascended as a sweet aroma to Yahweh. Nothing for the priest to eat, nothing for the offerer, everything went up to God. It was really the ultimate act of worship. The worshiper would lay hands on the animal, identifying with it, saying, "This represents me, entirely given over to God." But, and this is important, our sources clarify this wasn't like the first step to get God's attention. It was the climax of worship, an act of total consecration you could only make if you were already in a purified communing relationship. And for that reason, the Jallah is never ever called a zebah. One's a shared meal signifying communion, the other is total surrender signifying consecration. Different things.
Okay, wow. So putting all that together, what does it mean for David's lament back in Psalm 51? Now we can really see the theological precision, can't we? How could he possibly celebrate a communion meal, a zebah, with the king he'd so grievously offended? The communion was shattered.
Exactly.
And how could he offer himself in total consecration, the wa, when his heart was completely divided, corrupt, rebellious? Total surrender was just impossible for him at that point.
He knew. Our sources make it clear. David knew those rights, zebah and Jolah. They presupposed an intact relationship, a relationship he had destroyed. His sin of lifted hand, his deliberate treason, had put him outside the system's remedies. His only hope lay beyond the rituals, in sovereign grace alone.
So this precision, these distinctions between the rites, it isn't just some, Old Testament historical detail. It's actually fundamental, absolutely fundamental for understanding the incredibly multifaceted work of Christ and also the nature of our Christian life. The confusion really kicks in when we just collapse all these different functions into the single word sacrifice and then apply it sort of monolithically just to the cross. When we do that, the text argues we create a kind of theological oxymoron, like a atazeba, a purification offering that's somehow also a communion meal, something that's just conceptually impossible in the Bible's own grammar.
That's a great way to put it. Our deep dive really clarifies Christ's work by showing how he fulfills, he actually transcends all these roles, but critically, in different aspects and moments of his redemptive work. So let's take the first one. The cross as the foundational zebah of the new covenant. We know Israel's history showed systematically that the old covenant wasn't ultimately sufficient, not because God's law was flawed, but because of the hardness of the human heart, right? And this created the need for that promise in Jeremiah 31, a new covenant, not written on stone, but written on the heart, grounded in radical forgiveness. And every covenant in biblical thinking is sealed with blood, the symbol of a life surrendered.
So when Jesus at the Last Supper holds up the cup and says, "This is my blood of the new covenant," Matthew 26.28, he's explicitly identifying his upcoming death as the inaugural zibah of this new covenant. His language, our sources point out, directly echoes Moses back in Exodus 24. So the cross, therefore, isn't primarily the purification act, the eights say, it's the foundational act that establishes the covenant relationship itself.
Precisely. It's the unifying blood. It's the surrendered life that creates the very bond of communion between God and humanity. And within that established communion, the promised forgiveness can flow. And just like that divine fire came down in Leviticus 9 to accept the offering, Jesus' resurrection is the Father's stamp of approval. It's the heavenly fire ratifying the Son's zebah, declaring the new covenant open for business, accepted forever.
That makes so much sense. The cross as the foundational zebah establishing communion. Okay, but then, if the cross is primarily about establishing communion, where does the purification part, the A function, come into Christ's work? Is that handled differently?
Yes, exactly. And this is where the book of Hebrews becomes so crucial. It points us toward the heavenly ministry of Christ as the definitive thinker. The author of Hebrews argues that the old Levitical it was just a shadow. Christ, after his resurrection and ascension, didn't enter some earthly sanctuary. He entered into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. That's Hebrews 9.24. As our great high priest, he goes into the true, most holy place, not with animal blood, but by his own blood, meaning in the power of his indestructible, eternally consecrated life. This heavenly, ongoing ministry is the ultimate end. His glorious presence before the Father purifies not just the heavenly things themselves, but, and this is vital for us, will cleanse your consciences from dead works. Hebrews 9.14 and 23. This is the deep cleansing the old system couldn't achieve. It's the cleansing that even deals with those free-handed sins, the ones that put David outside the system. So we're cleansed not just by a past event on a cross, but by the present continuing action of our high priest right now on the throne.
Wow. That's a powerful shift in perspective. Purification not just as a past event, but a present, ongoing reality because of Christ's heavenly ministry. Okay, so with that clarity on communion, zebah, and purification, how does the Lord's Supper fit into this whole picture?
Perfect question. This brings us right to the Lord's Supper as the continual zebah of the new covenant. Now, it is absolutely vital to stress, as our sources do, this is not a repetition of Christ's sacrifice. Hebrews is emphatic about that. He sat down because the work was finished, Hebrews 10:2-12. Instead, the Lord's Supper is our ongoing participation in the communion, the zebah that was established by the new covenant. It is, at its very heart, a communion meal, a banquet. It reminds us of, and actually makes us partakers in, the covenant sealed by Christ's blood.
So when you participate, you're doing exactly what those Israelites did with the Zebah Shalom. You're celebrating the peace, the shalom, the well-being you have with God because of a finished work. It's meant to be a time of joy, of thanksgiving, of a firmer relationship with him, and, crucially, with each other in the community.
That's it. We proclaim his death until he comes, yes, but we do it through this meal, anticipating that ultimate feast, the marriage supper of the Lamb, the final, eternal zebah. It's a New Testament way of sitting down to eat in God's presence, just rejoicing in the fellowship he made possible.
So reflecting on all this, what does it mean for you listening right now, really examining this term zebah? It forces us, doesn't it, to be much more precise with our language. And that precision actually leads to a much richer theology. This deep dive, I hope, has shown zebah isn't just a generic word for sacrifice. It specifically means a communion offering ending in a celebratory meal, an act of joy, of covenant affirmation.
And the contrast with the other offerings is just so clear and theologically important. Eighth for purification, Asium for restitution, Shul for total consecration. Keeping those distinct really illuminates the multifaceted beauty of Christ's work. He's the inaugural Zeba of the new covenant through his cross and resurrection. He's the definitive save through his ongoing priestly ministry from heaven. And as our sources hint we could explore another time, he's also the perfect shell in his life of total ascending devotion to the Father.
And for us, as people living in this new covenant, the implications are pretty profound, I think. It frees us from thinking our relationship with God is just sort of a legal transaction about sin. Instead, it invites you right into this vital space of joy and gratitude and actually enjoying God's presence, typified beautifully by that shared meal of the Zeba.
Absolutely. It reaffirms that the Lord's Supper is meant to be a celebratory meal of communion, not some somber rite where we try to reatone for sin. The ultimate point of the blood and the fire right from the beginning wasn't just forgiveness. It was always heading towards feasting, communion, relationship.
So maybe the next time you encounter these ideas or approach the Lord's table, ask yourself this. Are you primarily focused on just getting purified? Or are you preparing for a feast? What new dimensions of joy of communion might open up for you when you really start to grasp the grammar of the covenant? Thanks for diving deep with us today. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're really diving into a theological question that might genuinely shift how you think about some concepts you probably feel are very familiar. We've been working with some fascinating material